My name is Caroline, and I'm 58 years old, and I baked that cake to celebrate my engagement, but before I could even slice it, my mother looked me dead in the eye and said, "You'll never be a wife." The room froze, and just when I thought she couldn't hurt me more, my fiancé walked in with flowers, and my mother decided to destroy me in front of him. I've always believed that the smell of vanilla and butter could fix almost anything. It's what I tell myself every time I bake, when the world feels too heavy, when silence fills a house that used to hold laughter. On that particular afternoon, I was standing in my kitchen, icing a 3-layer cake for my engagement dinner. The sunlight poured through the window, coating the countertops in gold. Everything looked peaceful, almost perfect, until my mother opened her mouth. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling untouched in front of her. She'd been quiet for the past 10 minutes, watching me with those sharp eyes that always made me feel 12 again. Then, just as I smoothed the last bit of frosting along the side of the cake, she said it, so casually, like she was commenting on the weather. "You'll never be a wife, Caroline. Not really." The knife in my hand trembled. My breath caught somewhere between my chest and throat. I wanted to believe I misheard her, but I knew better. My mother's cruelty never needed volume. It just needed precision. Her words were small, sharp instruments, designed to find the softest part of me and twist. I stared at the cake, white frosting, delicate piping, perfection marred by the shaking of my hands. "What did you just say?" I asked, though I already knew. Margaret shrugged. "You heard me. A man can put a ring on your finger, but that doesn't make you a wife, not when you can't even keep one." Her tone was calm, almost bored, as if she were discussing an old recipe that never quite worked. I swallowed hard, trying to focus on the rhythm of the icing knife, gliding against the cake, the smell of sugar and cream. Anything but her voice. I thought I'd grown numb to her comments by now, but at 58, it still burned. Her words didn't age, they just found new ways to hurt. When I was 17, she told me I wasn't pretty enough to be chosen. When I was 25, she said I was too ambitious for men to love. And when my first engagement fell apart at 31, she didn't console me. She just said, "Told you so." Now, after all these years, I had found someone kind. Nathan. He was gentle, thoughtful, and patient in ways I didn't think men could be anymore. He saw me, the real me, not the version my mother had chipped away at for decades. Tonight, I was supposed to celebrate that, but leave it to Margaret to turn sweetness into bitterness. I glanced at her reflection in the kitchen window. Even at 78, she carried herself like the queen of a kingdom no one wanted to rule. Her hair perfectly set, pearls around her neck, lips pressed in judgment. "I don't know why you do this," I murmured. "Do what?" she asked, all innocence. "Say things you know will hurt me." Margaret sighed, a sound laced with disdain. "I'm not hurting you, Caroline. I'm helping you. I'm the only one honest enough to tell you the truth." I set the knife down, my pulse drumming in my ears. "Honesty isn't cruelty," I said quietly. "Cruelty?" She chuckled, the sound low and cold. "You think life isn't cruel? You think I'm cruel because I tell you what men won't? You'll see. He'll leave you too. They always do." The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. I wanted to scream. Instead, I took a deep breath, forcing my voice steady. "You've been saying that my whole life, Mother. Maybe you were wrong." She tilted her head, studying me. "Maybe," she said, but her tone made it clear she didn't believe it. I focused on the cake again. The frosting gleamed under the light, perfect and unblemished. I wanted it to be a symbol of something good. Proof that I could create beauty despite all the ugliness her words brought into my life. But even as I admired it, my hands shook. It wasn't just the knife trembling anymore. It was me. In the silence that followed, I could hear the ticking of the old wall clock. I'd grown up listening to that clock. It ticked through every argument, every cold dinner, every moment of quiet disapproval. I suddenly realized how long I'd been holding my breath. My throat tightened. I wanted to tell her to stop, to leave, to let me have this one day. But I knew how she'd respond, with a smirk, maybe a scoff, and another reminder that I wasn't good enough. So instead, I whispered, almost to myself, "You don't get to ruin this." Margaret didn't reply. She just sat back, lips curling faintly, like someone who knew she'd already succeeded. I took one more deep breath and forced myself to finish decorating the cake. Each motion felt mechanical. Spread, smooth, clean the edge. By the time I placed it on the counter, my arms were heavy. Then, from the hallway, I heard the sound of keys jingling. The front door opened, followed by a cheerful voice that melted the tension in an instant. "Caroline?" My heart lifted and sank all at once. Nathan. I wiped my hands on a towel, plastering on a smile before turning toward the doorway. The faint scent of cologne drifted in before I even saw him. And when he appeared, tall, smiling, holding a bouquet of flowers, the room changed completely. Only I couldn't bring myself to meet his eyes, because my mother's words were still echoing in my head. "You'll never be a wife, Caroline. Not really." When Nathan stepped through the door, everything felt lighter, at least for a moment. He was standing there, framed by the afternoon sunlight, holding a bouquet of daisies, my favorite. The sight of him usually filled me with warmth, but that day, my smile faltered before it even reached my lips. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his voice soft and familiar. "I thought I'd surprise you." I wiped my hands on my apron, my heart twisting between love and embarrassment. My eyes flicked toward my mother, who still sat at the kitchen table, stirring her cold tea as if she hadn't just ripped me apart with a single sentence. Nathan stepped closer, his expression open and kind. "You look beautiful," he said, "and the house smells amazing." I wanted to melt into his words, to let them replace the venom that still clung to my skin. Instead, I forced a smile and took the flowers from his hands. "They're lovely," I said, arranging them in a vase, though my voice sounded hollow, even to me. Margaret cleared her throat. "Daisies," she said flatly. "Simple. Practical. I suppose that suits Caroline." I shot her a sharp look. "Mother." But she only smiled, that thin, knowing smile she'd perfected decades ago. "What?" "I just said they're nice." Nathan, ever the gentleman, chuckled softly, trying to ease the tension. "I'm glad you think so, Mrs. Thompson. I wasn't sure what flowers to get, but Caroline mentioned once that daisies make her happy." Margaret tilted her head. "Happiness," she repeated, as if tasting the word for the first time. "That's nice." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Nathan glanced at me, sensing something he couldn't quite name. "That cake looks incredible," he said finally, nodding toward it. "Is that the famous lemon layer cake you told me about?" I smiled weakly. "The same one." "She's always been good at baking," my mother added smoothly. "Though, between us, she tends to overdo things, tries too hard to please people." I bit down hard on my tongue. Nathan, still polite, just nodded, though his eyes flickered with discomfort. He could tell what was happening, the undercurrent of malice that never needed to be spoken outright. "Would you like some tea?" Margaret asked him suddenly, her tone dripping with forced sweetness. "I have chamomile. It's soothing. Good for nerves." Nathan smiled kindly. "Sure. Thank you." She moved slowly to the counter, every action deliberate, as though she were marking territory in her own daughter's kitchen. The sound of the teapot filled the silence while Nathan shifted closer to me. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his eyes searching mine. I nodded, though my throat felt tight. "Just family things." He brushed my hand gently. "We don't have to stay if it's too much. But I couldn't walk away. Not yet. Not when my mother was watching us like a hawk, waiting to see if I'd crumble." "No," I said softly. "I'll be fine." Nathan squeezed my hand before stepping back. His warmth lingered, even after he moved away, a small flicker of comfort in a room full of shadows. As my mother set the teacup in front of him, I couldn't help but remember the first day I met Nathan. It was 2 years ago, in a small bookstore downtown. I was reaching for a copy of The Secret Garden when his hand brushed against mine. He'd smiled, awkward, charming, his laugh quiet but genuine. We spent an hour talking about books, family, and second chances. I told him I wasn't looking for anything serious, but he'd smiled and said, "Then I'll just be someone who listens." That was what won me over. Not grand gestures, but gentleness. He saw me, not as broken, not as old, not as a disappointment. Just me. I glanced back at him now, his face kind as ever, and felt the ache of how much I loved him. "Caroline," my mother's voice cut sharply through the air. Don't forget to slice the cake. Presentation matters, even when things fall apart. I froze. What does that mean? She smiled, stirring her tea again. Just that you've always been impulsive, too trusting. She turned her gaze on Nathan. That's why they all leave. The words landed like stones. Nathan set his teacup down carefully, his jaw tightening. I'm not sure what you mean by that, he said, his voice polite but edged. Oh, nothing, she said lightly. Just motherly concern. You seem like a nice man. I'd hate for you to end up disappointed. Mother, I said sharply, feeling my composure slip. Enough. She looked at me with mock innocence. I'm only saying what's true. He deserves to know what he's getting into. Nathan looked between us, confused, uneasy. Caroline, maybe we should... But before he could finish, Margaret leaned forward, her voice low and serpentine. You can pretend all you want, but the truth always comes out. Her eyes locked on mine, and she smiled in that way only she could, sweet on the surface, cruel underneath. Then she leaned close enough that I could feel her breath on my ear and whispered, so only I could hear, wait until he learns who you really are. My stomach dropped. The room felt like it was spinning, the daisies in the vase blurring into white smudges. Nathan was still smiling, trying to keep things light, but my mother's words hung in the air, poisonous and heavy. I felt the ground shift beneath me. I didn't know what she meant exactly, but the way she said it, I knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The dining room was quiet, too quiet. The only sounds were the faint ticking of the clock on the wall and the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background. The table was set with care, white linens, gold-trimmed plates, and crystal glasses that caught the evening light just right. At the center of it all sat my cake, 3 layers, perfectly frosted, gleaming like ivory under the chandelier. It was supposed to be beautiful, a symbol of joy, of celebration. Instead, it felt like a test I was destined to fail. My hands were slick with nerves as I picked up the silver knife. I could still feel the echo of my mother's words from earlier, curling around my thoughts like smoke. Wait until he learns who you really are. The phrase wouldn't leave me alone. It replayed in my head again and again until it didn't sound like her anymore. It sounded like me. Nathan sat across from me, smiling kindly, unaware of the storm brewing behind my composure. My mother was beside him, her posture rigid, her lips painted into that same judgmental smirk I'd known my entire life. Her eyes were on me, watching, waiting. Go ahead, Caroline, she said. You should do the honors. I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. My fingers tightened around the knife's handle. The blade caught the light for a moment before sinking through the top layer of frosting. The sound of it sliding through the cake should have been satisfying, but it wasn't. It reminded me of something else, a memory I wished I could bury. Every celebration I'd ever had was tainted by her somehow. My 21st birthday, when she told me I was already too old to be reckless. My college graduation, when she whispered that my dress made me look desperate. My 40th birthday, when I threw myself a small party and she announced to the room, "Imagine still being alone at 40." Every milestone, every smile, every brief flicker of pride, I could still hear her voice turning it into shame. And then, of course, there was the wedding that never happened. I could see it as clearly as if it were yesterday. Me, 29, nervous and giddy, standing in a white dress while my fiancé, Tom, paced outside the church. My mother had cornered him minutes before the ceremony, whispering something I never got to hear. 10 minutes later, he was gone. No note, no explanation. Just gone. She claimed afterwards she'd only told him the truth. The truth, according to her, was that I wasn't wife material, that I was too needy, too emotional, too much. And now, 30 years later, she sat across from me, sipping tea as if she hadn't carved those words into my bones. The knife slipped slightly in my hand, the tip dragging through the icing. A small smear streaked across the pristine surface. Margaret chuckled. Still can't do anything right. The words were soft, almost playful, but they hit me harder than any slap. I froze for a second, staring at the mark on the cake. It wasn't much, just a smudge, but to her it was proof. Proof that I was clumsy, that I was lesser, that I couldn't keep up with the image she wanted the world to see. Nathan reached out, his hand resting gently over mine. "Hey," he said softly, his eyes meeting mine. "It's just a cake." I wanted to smile, but the kindness in his voice cracked something open inside me. Tears pricked my eyes before I could stop them. He squeezed my hand. "It looks perfect to me," he whispered. But before I could answer, my mother let out a small, dismissive laugh. "Perfect? Oh, Nathan, you're sweet. But let's be honest. Caroline's always been good at appearances. She decorates everything, cakes, words, even herself. But sugar can't hide what's underneath." I looked at her then, really looked. For a moment, I thought I saw something fragile in her eyes, some flicker of exhaustion or fear. But it vanished as soon as I noticed it. She took a slow sip of tea, watching me over the rim of her cup, like a cat playing with a trapped bird. My throat tightened. "Why are you doing this?" I asked quietly. Her lips twitched into a half smile. "Doing what?" "You're so dramatic, Caroline. I'm just saying Nathan deserves to know who you really are before he gets too comfortable." Nathan frowned. "Mrs. Thompson, that's enough." She waved him off, her gaze fixed on me. "Maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I think honesty is important in a marriage. Don't you, Caroline?" I felt my pulse hammering in my neck. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, you know," she said, her tone casual, almost playful. "Maybe Nathan should hear it from me instead." Her smirk widened, and I could see it then. The same look she gave Tom all those years ago. The one that said she was about to destroy something and would enjoy every second of it. Nathan looked between us, confused and uneasy. "Hear what?" he asked slowly. I couldn't breathe. My hands were still on the knife, my reflection glinting faintly off the polished blade. Margaret leaned forward, her voice a whisper laced with poison. "Maybe Nathan deserves to know the truth about you." The room fell silent. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. I stared at her, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear my own voice. "And what truth would that be, Mother?" She smiled, softly, knowingly. "Oh, you'll see." For a long, unbearable moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of the clock. I could feel the knife still in my hand, its weight heavy, cold. Margaret's words hung in the air like smoke, curling around us, thick and suffocating. Nathan glanced at me, confusion clouding his usually calm eyes. "What truth?" he asked softly, looking from me to my mother. Margaret smiled. That smile, the one that always meant trouble. "Oh, it's nothing new, dear. I'm sure Caroline would have told you eventually, if she thought you could handle it." "Mother," I said, my voice shaking. "Don't." But she ignored me, leaning back in her chair, perfectly composed. "You know," she began, as if she were telling a bedtime story, "Caroline has always been passionate, emotional, some might say. That's not necessarily bad, of course, but it's caused her problems in the past." I felt my heart drop. "Stop." Margaret's eyes flicked to me briefly, a glint of satisfaction flashing there before she continued. "Back when she was younger, she was engaged. Once before. A lovely man, very promising. But Caroline had a temper, didn't you, dear?" Nathan frowned slightly. "What are you talking about?" My mother sighed dramatically, as if the burden of truth-telling was hers alone to bear. "He left her after she, well, how should I put this delicately, became involved with someone else. A co-worker, I think. It was quite the scandal back then." I froze. My pulse pounded in my ears. "That's not what happened." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Then maybe you'd like to explain why he called off the wedding 2 days before the ceremony, or why he told me himself that you were too unstable to trust." Nathan's expression shifted, his brows knitting together. "Caroline?" I stood there, mouth dry, words tangled somewhere in my throat. "That's not true," I said finally, barely above a whisper. "I didn't cheat. He left because she—" I stopped myself, shaking my head. "She told him lies, just like this." Margaret laughed softly, her tone almost affectionate. "Oh, darling, blaming your mother again? You've been telling that story for 30 years. Don't you think it's time to own your mistakes?" The room tilted slightly, or maybe it was just me. I reached for the edge of the counter to steady myself. "You destroyed that relationship. You told him things that weren't true. I told him what he needed to hear, she said smoothly. A mother has to protect her daughter from herself sometimes. Nathan looked from one of us to the other, his jaw tight. I don't understand. Why would she lie about something like that? I met his gaze, desperate for him to see the truth. Because she doesn't want me to be happy. She never has. Margaret gave a quiet, pitying laugh. Oh, please, that's your story, isn't it? Poor, tragic Caroline, forever the victim. Do you ever stop? Enough, I snapped, my voice sharp and raw. You don't get to twist my life into your entertainment. Her expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something smug. She had won this game too many times to be afraid of losing. I'm just being honest, she said coolly. Nathan deserves to know who he's marrying. The room pulsed with silence. Nathan stood slowly, his face pale. I think I need a minute, he said, his voice calm but distant. Please, Nathan. I reached for him, but he stepped back. Just give me a second, he murmured, his hand raking through his hair. I didn't expect all this. I watched him turn and walk toward the back door, shoulders tense. The sound of it clicking shut behind him was louder than it should have been. It felt final. Margaret sipped her tea like nothing had happened. Well, she said, her tone almost cheerful. That went better than I expected. I stared at her, trembling. You're proud of yourself? Her gaze lifted lazily to meet mine. I'm realistic, Caroline. You've always been impulsive. I'm just saving you from another disaster. By making one? My voice cracked. By destroying every good thing I've ever had? You call it destruction, she said softly. I call it prevention. Something inside me snapped. The years of silence, of shrinking under her shadow, of believing every cruel word, it all came boiling out at once. I slammed my hand down on the table, making the teacups rattle. Enough, I shouted. Enough of your lies, your games, your poison. For once, she didn't have a ready reply. Her lips parted slightly, and I saw surprise flicker in her eyes. But then, just as quickly, she composed herself. You should calm down, she said quietly. You're embarrassing yourself. I laughed bitterly, the sound unfamiliar in my own ears. You've been embarrassing me my whole life. Congratulations. You finally succeeded in scaring away the one person who made me feel whole again. Margaret looked away, uninterested. If he leaves because of this, he was never the right one. I stood there, shaking, unable to find any words big enough to hold the fury and heartbreak inside me. By the time Nathan returned, he didn't look angry, just tired. I think I'm going to head home, he said softly. Nathan, please. I just need to think, Caroline. There's a lot here I didn't know. I nodded numbly, watching as he grabbed his jacket and walked out. The sound of the front door closing was the final cut of the knife. My mother's chair creaked as she stood. You'll thank me someday, she said, placing her empty cup in the sink. It's better to know now than later. She left the room humming, as if she hadn't just gutted me. When I finally found the strength to move, I sat down at the table, staring at the ruined cake, the untouched plates, the daisies wilting in their vase. The silence was unbearable. That night, long after she'd gone to bed, I sat alone in the dark kitchen. My phone buzzed beside me. It was a message from Nathan. I can't do this right now. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I pressed the phone to my chest and whispered, She did it again. I stood by the window and watched Nathan's car disappear down the quiet street. The taillights glowed red for a moment, then vanished into the darkness. The sound of the engine faded, leaving only silence, and the faint creak of the old house settling around me. On the counter behind me, the bouquet of daisies sat where he'd left them, their bright white petals wilting under the soft kitchen light. He was gone. For a long while, I didn't move. My hands hung limply at my sides, my chest aching in that hollow, familiar way, the kind of pain that wasn't new, just rediscovered. I'd felt it before, too many times. Then, from the doorway, I heard her voice, calm, casual, like a knife disguised as silk. I warned. You, didn't I? I turned slowly. Margaret stood there with her arms folded, the faintest smirk on her face. She looked almost satisfied, as if watching everything fall apart was the outcome she'd expected all along. I told you he'd leave, she added, almost gently. Don't, I said quietly. My voice came out rough, barely holding together. Don't what? Speak the truth? I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You don't know what truth is, Mother. You only know control. Her smile didn't falter. I know reality, Caroline, and reality is, you can't hold on to anyone. You never could. I walked past her, refusing to look at her face any longer. The dining table still looked frozen in time. 2 empty plates, untouched glasses, and that perfect white cake sitting in the middle like some cruel joke. The smell of lemon and sugar filled the air, but all I could taste was ash. I sank into one of the chairs, staring at it. This was supposed to be my night, the beginning of something good. But like every beginning I'd ever had, she'd found a way to end it before it even started. My mind started replaying every word she'd said that night, and then, as if a floodgate opened, every cruel phrase from years past came rushing back. You talk too much. Men hate that. No one wants someone who's so sensitive, Caroline. If you weren't so emotional, people might take you seriously. You'll thank me one day for keeping you from making a fool of yourself. Each one hit me like a stone, and I realized something I'd never allowed myself to say aloud. She had been shaping me my entire life, molding me into someone afraid to live without her approval. And I'd let her. I thought back to my younger self, bright-eyed, full of dreams. I'd wanted to study art, to move to the city, to paint. I even got accepted to an art program when I was 22. But my mother said it was a waste of money. You're not talented enough to make a living off that, she told me. Better stay close to home. Someone has to look after me. So I stayed. And little by little, I stopped drawing. I stopped dreaming. She had called it love. I see now it was control. The longer I sat there, the more I felt it. The years she'd stolen, the relationships she'd ruined, the small pieces of joy she'd chipped away at until I barely recognized myself. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping harshly against the tile. The sight of the cake on the table made me sick. It wasn't a symbol of love anymore. It was a monument to every time I'd tried to please her. Without thinking, I grabbed the serving knife and drove it through the top layer. The sound of the blade hitting the plate underneath echoed through the room. Then I shoved the entire cake off the table. It hit the floor with a dull, heavy splatter, frosting smeared across the tiles, crumbs scattering. Margaret gasped, "Caroline!" Her voice was sharp, but not out of concern, out of irritation. "What on earth are you doing? That was perfectly good food." I turned on her, shaking. "It was poison," I said. "Every bit of it, just like your words." Her eyes widened, but I didn't wait for her to answer. I was done. Done with her control, her cruelty, her endless games. "You've taken everything from me," I said, my voice breaking. "Every good thing that's ever tried to come into my life, you've destroyed it before I could even hold on to it." Margaret stepped closer, her voice dropping to that familiar, condescending tone. "You're overreacting, Caroline. You always do." I laughed through my tears, shaking my head. "You don't get to tell me what I am anymore." And before she could say another word, I turned and stormed out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there among the wreckage. The hallway felt darker than usual as I walked toward my room. My heart was still pounding, but something else was rising beneath the anger. A kind of strange, cold clarity. For the first time in my life, I was seeing her for what she truly was. Not a protector, not even a mother in the way a mother should be, but a woman so broken by her own bitterness that she'd spent her life trying to make me as small as she felt. As I reached the top of the stairs, I caught sight of something in her room. Her door was slightly open, and the faint glint of moonlight reflected off a small wooden box on her dresser. It looked old, familiar, the kind of thing she never let anyone touch. I hesitated, my pulse quickening. I'd seen that box my whole life, but had never been allowed to open it. I used to think it held jewelry or keepsakes, but now, after everything she'd said, I wasn't so sure. I took a step toward the doorway, my hand brushing the frame. Somewhere deep down, a voice whispered that whatever was inside that box might finally explain everything, why she was the way she was, and why she'd spent a lifetime trying to break me. The moonlight spilled across the hallway as I stepped into my mother's room. Everything in it looked as pristine as ever. The lace curtains perfectly pressed, her perfume bottles lined in a neat row, the old family photos dusted and orderly. But there was no warmth here, no softness. It was a museum of her control, frozen in time. My eyes went straight to the dresser. The small wooden box sat there, its mahogany surface smooth and slightly worn, the brass clasp dulled from years of handling. I hesitated for a moment, glancing toward the closed door, half expecting to hear her footsteps behind me. But the house was silent. My fingers trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside was a folded letter, yellowed at the edges, tied with a faded blue ribbon. Beneath it lay a photograph, my parents on their wedding day. My father's smile was wide, but my mother's looked forced, like she was trying to convince herself she belonged in that picture. The letter was addressed in familiar handwriting. To my dearest Margaret. I unfolded it carefully, my breath catching as I began to read. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and there are things I never found the courage to tell you in life. You were a good wife to me, though I know I did not always make you feel loved as you deserved. Before you, there was someone else, a woman I cared for deeply, but fate had other plans. I married you because it was right, not because it was easy. Over the years, I hoped affection would grow into love, and though it never became the passion you once dreamed of, I did come to care for you in my own quiet way. But Margaret, please do not let resentment harden your heart. I've seen it creeping in. Don't let our daughter carry the weight of what you never received. She is everything good that we did right. If I ever did anything worth pride in this life, it was her. Let her be free, Margaret. Don't make my mistakes hers. Don't let bitterness become her inheritance. With love, always Thomas. By the time I reached the end, my vision blurred with tears. My father's words sank into me, heavy and painful. He had seen it even then. Her bitterness, her quiet resentment. It had begun long before I was old enough to notice. I realized then that my mother's cruelty wasn't born out of hatred for me. It came from a wound she never healed. She had been the woman left behind long before I ever entered the story. I sat on the edge of her bed, the letter trembling in my hands. I cried, not just for myself, but for the little girl I had been, for the young woman who had tried so hard to be loved, and even for my mother, who never knew how to love without hurting. When dawn crept in through the window, I was still sitting there. The first rays of morning light fell across the letter, and for the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me. My anger hadn't vanished, but it had softened around the edges. I folded the letter carefully and walked downstairs. Margaret was already in the kitchen, her back to me, stirring her tea like always. She looked up when she heard my footsteps. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "No," I said quietly, pulling the letter from my pocket. "I found this." Her eyes flickered for the briefest moment. I saw recognition and fear. "Where did you get that?" "In your box." She stiffened. "You had no right to go through my things." "Maybe not," I said, unfolding the letter. "But I think I had a right to know the truth." Before she could interrupt, I began to read it aloud. My voice trembled at first, but then it steadied. Each word echoed through the kitchen like a confession long overdue. When I finished, silence filled the room. My mother's teacup trembled slightly in her hands. For a moment, I thought she would deny it, twist it like she twisted everything else, but she didn't. Her shoulders slumped. The strength she always wore like armor seemed to slip away, piece by piece. "He wasn't supposed to tell you that," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" I asked. "So you could keep punishing me for something that wasn't even mine to bear?" She looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time I saw not a monster, but a broken woman drowning in her own regret. "He loved someone else, Caroline," she said softly. "He loved her until the day he died. And every time I looked at you, I saw her." The words stung, but beneath them I felt something like pity. "That wasn't my fault," I said. "I know," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. But it felt like it was. I stood there, watching as she covered her face with trembling hands. It was the first time I had ever seen her cry. I should have felt triumphant, vindicated, but all I felt was sorrow. "I can't keep living like this," I said quietly. "I can't keep being the vessel for your pain." She didn't answer. She just nodded, her eyes red and weary. I turned toward the stairs, went to my room, and began packing my suitcase. For once, I didn't second guess it. I wasn't running away this time. I was finally walking toward myself. As I zipped the suitcase shut, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. For a second, I thought it might be my mother again, some last plea or insult. But when I looked, the name on the screen made my breath catch. Voicemail from Nathan. I hesitated before pressing play. His voice came through, soft but certain. Caroline, I've been thinking. I need to see you. My heart fluttered. A cautious, uncertain hope. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was just the beginning of something new. I took one last look at the house, then walked out the door. The letter folded safely in my hand. The air was crisp when I reached the park, the kind of autumn morning that smells like wood smoke and wet leaves. The sky hung low and gray, but the ground beneath it glowed, a patchwork of orange and gold scattered across the path. I spotted Nathan near the old oak bench by the pond, his hands tucked in his coat pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched against the wind. For a moment, I just stood there, watching him. I'd rehearsed what I was going to say a dozen times since I got his message, but now that I saw him, the words tangled up somewhere in my chest. When he looked up and saw me, he smiled. A hesitant, weary smile, but a smile nonetheless. You came, he said. I wasn't sure you'd still want to see me, I admitted, walking toward him. I wasn't sure either, he said quietly. But here we are. We sat down on the bench together. The world around us was calm, the faint rustle of leaves, the gentle rippling of the pond, the distant laughter of a child chasing a duck. Ordinary sounds that somehow made the silence between us feel safe. I owe you an explanation, I began. My voice trembled, but I didn't shy away from it. About my mother, about what really happened all those years ago. Nathan didn't say anything, just nodded, his eyes focused on me. There was no accusation in his gaze, only patience. So I told him everything. I told him about growing up under Margaret's control, about how she'd made me doubt my worth at every turn. I told him about my first fiancé, the one she drove away, and the way she'd twisted the truth to make it sound like my fault. I told him about the lies she told him too, and how every cruel word was her way of trying to keep me small, afraid, and dependent. When I was done, my throat ached and my eyes burned. That's the truth, I said finally, all of it. I should have told you sooner, but I was so used to hiding her damage that I didn't know how to talk about it anymore. Nathan leaned back on the bench, exhaling slowly. The wind rustled through the branches above us, scattering more leaves around our feet. You should have told me sooner, he said gently, but I understand now. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him right. You do? He nodded. When she said those things, I didn't want to believe them, but part of me wondered, because I didn't know the story. I didn't know you, not really, but now... He paused, searching for the right words. Now I do, and it makes sense. Tears welled up in my eyes. I'm sorry, I whispered. Not for her, but for letting her get between us, for doubting myself, and you. Nathan reached over and took my hand. You don't have to apologize for surviving her, Caroline. You just have to stop letting her write the rest of your story. I looked at him, his words sinking deep into me. For so long, I had lived as if my mother's voice was law. Every decision, every doubt, it all came from her. But sitting there with Nathan, hearing his quiet steadiness, I felt something I hadn't in years. Peace. I smiled faintly and reached for the small box beside me. I brought something, I said. He raised an eyebrow as I opened it to reveal a small cake, round, imperfect, the frosting uneven in places, the edges slightly lopsided. I baked it this morning, I said with a little laugh. It's not perfect, but it's mine. Nathan's eyes softened. This one looks real, he said. We both laughed then, a gentle, healing kind of laughter. It felt like something old breaking apart, like rust cracking off iron. I cut us each a slice, the knife sliding through with a soft, satisfying sound. He took a bite and closed his eyes. It's good, he said. Really good. It's not too sweet? I asked, teasing. Maybe a little, he said, smiling. But so are you. I rolled my eyes, laughing again, but the warmth in my chest was overwhelming. We sat there, eating cake under the falling leaves, talking about everything and nothing. For once, there were no sharp words, no judgments, no ghosts hovering over my shoulder. Just the two of us, and the quiet understanding that maybe, just maybe, we could start again. As the sun began to set, the light turned amber, spilling across the pond like melted honey. Nathan reached out, brushing a stray leaf from my hair. "You know," he said softly, "you don't have to be perfect for me to love you." "I know," I whispered, and this time I meant it. We sat in silence after that, watching the last of the daylight fade. For the first time in my life, I felt whole, not because of anyone's approval, but because I had finally told the truth. Then my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it, not wanting to break the calm, but something in my gut told me to look. The screen lit up with a familiar number. Margaret's home phone. My heart sank. I answered, my voice cautious. "Hello?" It wasn't my mother's voice on the other end. It was a nurse. "Mrs. Thompson, this is St. Mary's Hospital. I'm calling about your mother." My heart dropped. What happened? "She's had a cardiac episode," the nurse said gently. "You should come as soon as you can." The world around me blurred. The laughter, the warmth, the autumn light, all of it seemed to fade away. Nathan touched my arm. "Caroline, what is it?" I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "It's my mother," I whispered. "She's in the hospital." Hospitals have a smell that clings to you, that sterile mix of bleach and despair that makes every hallway feel colder than it should. As I hurried through the fluorescent corridors, the sound of my shoes echoing off the linoleum, I felt like I was walking through someone else's nightmare. When I reached my mother's room, she looked small. I don't think I'd ever seen her look small before. Margaret Thompson had always filled every room she entered. Her voice, her opinions, her presence, it all demanded attention. But now, under the harsh hospital light, she was just a fragile woman lying against white sheets, her skin pale and thin as paper. For a long moment, I just stood in the doorway, unable to move. Part of me wanted to turn around, to walk away and never look back. Another part, some stubborn, childlike piece of me, still wanted to see her open her eyes and say something sharp and alive, something her. Instead, the only sound was the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Finally, I forced myself forward and sat in the chair beside her bed. I could see the faint rise and fall of her chest beneath the blanket. Her hands, once so steady and strong, now trembled slightly as she stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, and for a second I thought she didn't recognize me. "Caroline?" Her voice was a thin rasp, barely more than a whisper. "It's me, Mother." She blinked, her gaze trying to focus. "You came." "Of course I did." A faint smile tugged at her lips. "I didn't think you would. You were so angry." Swallowed hard, trying to find words that didn't sound hollow. "I was," I admitted. "But I'm here." Silence settled between us again, heavy but not cruel. I studied her face, the wrinkles etched deep by years of scowling and worry, the corners of her mouth that had forgotten how to lift without bitterness. She looked like a stranger and my mother all at once. After a long pause, she whispered, "I read your father's letter again." My heart tightened. "You remember it?" Her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. Shame, maybe. He was right. I let bitterness eat me alive. I wanted him to love me the way he loved her, and when he couldn't, I took it out on you. Hearing her say it out loud hurt more than I expected, but it also loosened something inside me, like a knot slowly untying. "I didn't know," I said quietly. "I thought you just hated me." She shook her head weakly. "I never hated you. I just—" Her breath hitched, her words breaking apart. "I was afraid." "Afraid?" "Afraid to see you happier than I ever was." The word struck me like a physical blow. For decades, I'd tried to understand why she resented me, why every time I smiled, she found a way to darken it. And now, in one fading breath, she gave me the answer. I reached for her hand. It was cold, thin, weightless in mine. "You didn't have to do that," I whispered. "You could have been happy too." She gave a faint, sad smile. Maybe, but I didn't know how. For a long moment, we just sat there, her hand in mine, the steady beep of the monitor marking time we both knew was running out. "Caroline," she murmured, her eyelids drooping. "Do you forgive me?" Tears filled my eyes. I wanted to say no. That forgiveness wasn't something she deserved after all the years she'd taken from me. But the truth was, I didn't want to carry her anymore. Not the anger, not the grief, not the echoes of her voice telling me I was never enough. "Yes," I said softly. "I forgive you." She smiled faintly. "Good girl," she whispered, her old phrase, but this time it didn't sting. Her breathing slowed. Her hand went limp in mine. And then, just like that, the monitor flatlined. I didn't cry right away. I just sat there, still holding her hand, staring at the woman who had shaped my life in ways she'd never understand. It felt like watching a door close that I'd been standing in front of for years, unable to step through. When I finally left the hospital, dawn was breaking. The world was quiet, the air cool and sharp. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight of her voice lift from my shoulders. The silence wasn't empty. It was peaceful. A few days later, after the funeral, I stood by her grave, a small bouquet of fresh daisies in my hands. The same kind Nathan once brought me. I knelt down and placed them on the soil, brushing away a tear that slid down my cheek. "I'll live free now," I whispered. Nathan stood a few steps behind me, silent, respectful. When I turned to look at him, he reached for my hand, his fingers warm and steady against mine. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The wind carried the scent of the flowers, the sound of distant birds, and I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Peace. As we walked away from the graveyard, I glanced back one last time. The name Margaret Thompson etched into the stone gleamed faintly in the morning light. For a brief moment, I thought it was over. The years of pain, the echoes of her cruelty, the endless cycle of guilt. I thought I had finally buried the past with her. But as we reached the gate, a strange chill ran down my spine, a whisper I couldn't explain. In my mind, my voice trembled as I said it. I thought the past was buried, but it wasn't done with me yet. It's strange how life can start over in the most unexpected ways. Months passed after my mother's funeral, and each day felt like peeling away an old layer of skin. Painful, but freeing. The silence in my house, once oppressive, had become something softer, something kind. For the first time, quiet didn't mean loneliness. It meant peace. One morning, I stood in the kitchen where everything had fallen apart, the same place that had held years of judgment, tears, and apologies. The counter still bore faint scratches from where the cake had fallen that night. I touched one with my fingertips and smiled. It didn't hurt anymore. Those marks weren't reminders of failure. They were proof of survival. That was the morning the idea for Second Slice was born. The name came to me suddenly, like a whisper. It felt right. My life had been one long recipe of mistakes and second chances, and for once, I wanted to share something good that came from it. 6 months later, the dream was real. My small bakery sat on the corner of Maple and Fifth, right next to an old flower shop. The sign above the door read, "Second Slice" in soft gold letters, and inside, everything smelled like buttercream and new beginnings. The walls were pale yellow, the tables covered in fresh linens, and sunlight poured through the windows, warming every corner. Every cake I baked had meaning, a lemon one for resilience, a chocolate one for comfort, a simple vanilla for peace. I poured my story into each recipe, folding it gently into the batter, as if somehow people could taste the journey that brought me here. On opening day, I stood behind the counter, my apron dusted with flour, watching strangers walk in and smile as they tasted my cakes. Each compliment, each delighted laugh, felt like reclaiming something my mother had stolen, a piece of joy she'd told me I wasn't allowed to have. Baking no longer felt like a test I had to pass. It was an act of love, for myself, for my healing, for the life I had almost lost to her bitterness. Nathan was there, of course. He had been there through every step of building. The shop, hammering shelves, tasting frosting, encouraging me when self-doubt crept in. He'd never once asked me to hurry my healing, never pushed me to move on. He just stood beside me, steady and patient, like a lighthouse guiding me home. That afternoon, when the rush of customers slowed, I noticed he'd disappeared. I turned to the counter, ready to call his name, when I saw him standing by the window, holding something behind his back. My heart skipped. "Nathan?" I asked, smiling. "What are you up to?" He grinned. "I was thinking, you've built something beautiful here, Caroline. You've rebuilt yourself." Before I could respond, he pulled a small velvet box from behind his back and opened it. Inside was a simple gold ring, elegant and understated, like him. For a second, I couldn't breathe. "I didn't want the first proposal to be the one you remembered," he said softly. "So I thought maybe this time we could start new. No ghosts, no shadows, just us." Tears blurred my vision. Around us, a few of my regular customers had stopped to watch, their faces glowing with warmth and quiet excitement. The whole shop seemed to hold its breath. I pressed my flour-dusted hands to my mouth, laughing through the tears. "Nathan, He smiled. "You don't have to say anything yet. Just, do you want to keep baking a life with me?" I laughed again, my chest aching with happiness. "Yes," I said finally, the word breaking free like sunlight after a storm. "Yes, I do." Applause filled the little bakery as Nathan slipped the ring onto my finger. It fit perfectly, not because it was flawless, but because it was real. We celebrated the only way that felt right. I walked to the counter and brought out a small cake I'd made that morning. White frosting, uneven edges, decorated with real daisies. Not for perfection, but for meaning. I set it on the table, picked up the knife, and smiled at Nathan. "This one," I said softly, "is for us." I cut the first slice, my hands steady this time. The room filled with laughter, light, and the faint scent of sugar and lemon. As we shared that slice of cake, I realized something profound. I wasn't baking for approval anymore. Not for my mother, not for anyone. I was baking for the joy of it, for the love of creating something beautiful with my own two hands. In that moment, I found my closing words, words that had lived in me for years, but only now made sense. "I used to bake for approval," I said quietly, smiling at Nathan as he reached for my hand. "Now I bake to celebrate myself." Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting golden light through the bakery window. It hit the walls, the cakes, the flowers, and finally, the ring on my finger, turning everything to a soft, radiant glow. I looked around my little shop at the customers laughing, the smell of sweetness in the air, the man beside me who had never stopped believing in me, and I felt completely, utterly free. Some scars never fade, but they don't have to. They're not marks of shame. They're reminders of how far you've come. And as I lifted that final slice of cake to my lips, I realized I wasn't tasting sugar. I was tasting freedom. In the end, I realized I didn't bake that cake for her approval. I baked it to prove I could stand on my own. My mother's words once broke me, but they also pushed me toward the woman I was meant to become. Every scar she left became a recipe for my strength. I don't bake to please anyone anymore. I bake to celebrate the life she said I could never have. If this story touched something deep in your heart, don't forget to share it with someone who's been told they'll never be enough. Every like and every subscription keeps stories like this alive. But tell me, if someone you loved tried to destroy your happiness out of jealousy, would you forgive them or finally walk away?